Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Hey everyone, it's Mikki here. You're listening to Mikkipedia, and this week on the podcast, I speak to Dr Alessio Fasano about gluten, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, the gut microbiome, and autoimmune conditions. Dr Fasano led the research team that discovered and named zonulin, an enzyme in the gut that is activated in response to gluten. And we talk all about the importance of this in relation to health in general and who needs to be mindful of this response and of gluten in their food. And we also talk about other pillars of health that impact on the gut. Importantly, Dr. Fasano emphasises that for most people, it isn't one trigger that sets off the immune response. It is multiple factors that need to be present. And we talk about this and a whole host of other things in this fascinating interview with Dr. Fasano. I felt so privileged to be able to speak to him. He is amazing. So Dr. Alessio Fasano has dedicated his life to improving the quality of life for people with celiac disease and other gluten-related disorders. He founded the Centre for Celiac Research at the University of Maryland School of Medicine in 1996. In 2013, he moved the centre to Massachusetts General Hospital and renamed it the Centre for Celiac Research and Treatment. He is the chief of the Division of Paediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition at Mass General Hospital for Children and a professor of paediatrics at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Fasano is the author of Gluten Freedom, a book for general readers about celiac disease, gluten-related disorders, and the gluten-free diet. He also co-authored Gut Feelings, the Microbiome and Our Health, and this was published in March 2021. And we have a bit of a discussion in and around the book itself, but of course, the things that we talk about in today's interview sort of expand beyond that and touch on a lot of what his research across the course of his career has really looked at. I have links to Dr. Fasano where you can find him and where you can find his books as well in the show notes. And before we crack on into the interview, I'd just like to remind you that the best way to support the podcast is to hit subscribe on the platform you listen to your podcasts on. This increases the exposure that Mikkipedia has out there amongst the thousands of other podcasts that are released weekly. The more exposure we get, the more opportunity people get to benefit from the information that my guests, such as Dr. Fasano, share with us, and that would just be amazing. All right, team, I hope that you enjoy the conversation that I had with Dr. Alessio Fasano. Dr. Fasano, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I have been aware of your work for a number of years now, and I'm really excited to have a chat to you about autoimmunity, the microbiome, gluten, and all the things. Can you just sort of give us a little bit of a brief background as to your professional experience and also your interest in autoimmunity and how that, sort of has transpired?
Yeah. So, Mikki, thank you, first of all, for having me. Again, science is a journey of serendipity. So I can blame that from the very beginning, I want to study autoimmunity, but that's not the truth. It's just that, I was pushed in that direction by the way that science was going. This started a long time ago when I was studying what I was very much interested in, how microorganisms interact with us. And why sometimes this interaction goes in the wrong direction, meaning that they make us sick. And specifically, I was studying a bug that was making particularly kids, because I'm a pediatric gastroenterologist by training, very sick and die very fast, cholera.
Oh, wow. Oh, yes.
And I was developing a vaccine against cholera. There was a total failure because it did not work. So 2 years of work literally flushed in the toilet because they still have diarrhea with this vaccine. but led to the discovery of some other mechanisms that, cholera uses eventually to cause diarrhea that was targeting the permeability of the gut, making the gut leakier, and therefore create the condition of more fluid in the gut that the Vibrio cholera needs to swim out and go to another host. And, from there, I reasoned that's strange that we have this complex machinery, because we understood how this other, toxin was working, just to be the target of cholera. And we reasoned that probably cholera was mimicking something that we do physiologically. And that led almost 20 years ago to discover a molecule that is called zonulin that increased gut permeability. And of course, as typically we do, we ask, okay, what is the pathology? What happened when the system goes out of control? And one of the common denominators in which the zonulin pathway is upregulated, and therefore there is increased gut permeability, or autoimmunity. So that's a 35 years of journey into
Yes. Yeah, well, you did a fabulous job. So can we actually focus on zonulin for a minute, because obviously you discovered it, and as I understand, you named it as well. What is the importance of this in the gut, and what activates it?
Yeah. So for many, many years, particularly for folks that focus on the mechanism of why we develop chronic inflammatory diseases, and we talk not only autoimmunity, but also, neuroinflammation, neurodegeneration, cancer, food allergies. These are all conditions that, you have inflammation in your body that make you sick if you're genetically exposed to use this, to develop these problems. There's been always a puzzle to understand how you develop these conditions, since the paradigm, the corollary to develop this condition means that something from the environment come in our body and instigate the immune system to fight and generate inflammation. Under normal circumstances, this does not happen because we have barriers. The one that's visible, and we all know, is the skin barrier that protect us against the surrounding. And when the skin barrier doesn't work, we develop, rash and a series of problems and so on and so forth. But the largest interface is the gut. You take, the gut of an adult, you stretch on the floor, you cover a double tennis court. It's huge. And there is a lot of stuff coming through every day. The other thing that is peculiar of the gut compared to the skin, for example, that, while the skin has several layers of cells, the gut has only a single layer. So imagine this sort of wall with a single, layer of bricks. And the idea was that in between bricks, there was cement. So everything that comes from an environment in our body has to go through the bricks, i.e. to the cells. And large molecules, the ones that instigate inflammation, cannot come through the cell under normal circumstances. So it was always puzzling how that happened. Until the late 80s, a Japanese group, discovered that actually there's not cement in between the cells. Rather, there are gates, most of the time closed, but when they open, this space in between cells open up, and this, stuff from the environment can go through. Zonulin turns to be the key that makes this happening. So that's how this pretty much, got into the picture of how zonulin can be involved in regulation antigen trafficking by altering, and not only the gut barrier, but also the lungs, the blood-brain barrier, and so on and so forth. In terms of what makes zonulin to be produced in an excessive amount, so far we found two stimuli that seems to do that. One, an imbalance of the ecosystem of the gut, what we call dysbiosis. If the gut, microbiome goes off balance, is the strongest stimulus to release zonulin and makes this happening. The second stimulus is fragments that come from gluten, this molecule that is offending for people with celiac disease and other gluten-related disorders. Gluten cannot be completely digested in a single, elements, amino acids, but there are pieces of, fragment of gluten that we call peptides that are undigested. A couple of them can instigate cells to release zonulin and therefore increase gut permeability. So this is as much as we understand right now.
Okay, so everyone has zonulin, and it's not zonulin per se that's the problem. It's an excessive amount of zonulin that is
correct.
Okay, that is influenced by either your gut health or just gluten and its sort of peptides that are in gluten.
That's right. That's right. And again, even if the release of zonulin, no matter if it's due to gluten or the microbiome, is one of the main elements that will make you sick. If you have just that and you don't have a genetic predisposition to develop diseases, you will not. So the 5 pillars that seems to be important are genetic predisposition. So you have to have genes that make you, let's say, a risk for breast cancer. Okay. Then you have to have something in the environment that is the instigator of the inflammation. Then you have to have an increased gut permeability, so this instigator comes in your body. The 4th element that has to be the immune system that becomes hyperbelligerent, so turn on inflammation, it cannot turn it off. And the 5th element is indeed the microbiome, this imbalance that eventually put in motion that genetic predisposition march from predisposition to clinical outcome. That's the way we understand it. And they're highly, highly interconnected.
Yeah. And so with regards to autoimmune conditions, Dr. Fasano, are these on the rise, or are we just much more aware and able to diagnose them now than what maybe we were 20, 30, 40 years ago?
Both. Definitely there's been increased awareness, and therefore we are able to diagnose better some of these conditions. But for some autoimmune diseases like type 1 diabetes, you cannot miss it. It's not that it was underdiagnosed, because if you don't diagnose these people, they die, of course. So, but if you embrace a Western lifestyle, then you are higher risk to see this huge increase of, non-infected chronic inflammatory disease, including autoimmunity. We were under the impression, and this was justified by what we call the hygiene hypothesis. So in other words, we are born to deal with dirt and not clean and, being animals in the wild. And now we're too clean for our own goods, and particularly in the Western Hemisphere. And if we do that, we don't allow our immune system to be trained to point weapons against enemies rather than against ourselves, has happened in autoimmunity. And that leads to more susceptibility to chronic inflammation. This is partially true, but it's much more complex. There are these 5 elements, this perfect storm that come all together that eventually start that march from genetic predisposition to clinical outcome. Now, if you look at this phenomenon of increased epidemics of this chronic inflammatory disease, including autoimmunity, it's staggering how fast it goes up. And you can interpret this phenomenon in 2 different ways. If you're a pessimistic individual, it's like, gee, really, if I embrace a Western lifestyle, I'm ruining my life because I'm accelerating these conditions that will make me out of business in terms of morbidity and even mortality. However, if you want to look at the same phenomenon in a more positive way, the old paradigm, if you have the genes for breast cancer, it's destined. You're going to have it. There is nothing you can do about it. That's not true anymore. It really depends how you play your genetic cards.
Yeah.
If we understand what kind of mistake we've been making in the Western Hemisphere to play this game in a losing way, we can put together remedies to slow down, if not revert, this trend of uphill, a trend of autoimmunity. And we can eventually find, what is the holy grail, the primary prevention. So, because the fact that you have the genes is a precondition, as I told you, but, that's not automatic. The other 4 factors that I was telling you needs to come and play in order to, eventually translate this risk in an active disease.
Yeah. And Dr. Fasano, with the hygiene hypothesis, so is it that do we see differences in autoimmunity depending on where people live? Like if people live much more rurally compared to people who live much more urban?
We sure do.
Yeah.
If you live, in a more rural environment, if you have pets home, it probably the most impactful in nutrition. If you eat natural food, 0 kilometers or in season, whatever is produced, and not massive production, you typically tend to be more protected against autoimmunity and chronic inflammatory diseases in general. And again, I believe that this is much more than just the hygiene. It's a little bit more complex, as I was telling you, because all these elements that I just mentioned, where do you live, if you have pets home, if you have a rural environment in which you have animals around, and so on and so forth, will impact your microbiome. The microbiome is capable to epigenetically change, the way that our genes are expressed or repressed, and decide if, when, why, and how they are. And that's where the game is all about.
Yeah, that's remarkable to me, just the impact that the microbiome has on sort of all elements of health, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote this book that is called Gut Feelings.
Yes.
In which, my intro was, we are, as a species, the human species, it's always been extremely curious and being exploring for us, it's in our genes. We start exploring the new world, we discovered the Americas and then New Zealand and all nine yards. And then we went to the moon, and now we're looking the stars to see new civilizations. So it's not possible, it's just us. But the most remarkable, civilization are those microbes that we live with and co-evolve with. They are literally under our nose and we don't see it.
Yeah.
But they are absolutely remarkable, not only in their complexity, but how they can really dictate our destiny, from developing disease the way that we age, our behavior to eventually, what is going to be our lifespan. I mean, it's just remarkable.
And Dr. Fasano, so first and foremost, can we, I guess, talk about the microbiome, how our gut works, and how it gets disrupted? It's because I feel like almost everyone that I speak to in my work as a clinician, or even just sort of conversations that you have, people often talk about gut health, or, their gut's not great, or, so it's so prevalent. So can we just talk about, do the 101, I suppose, on it?
That's right. So with the disclaimer that this is a very active and dynamic field.
Yes.
Every day there are 750, 800 papers on microbiome published. There is no precedent in science, the wealth of information come out.
Yeah.
The way that, at least I understand, and again, I want to quote this, it's very personal interpretation, is that contrary to what we believed before, we are made by two genomes. Our human genome that we inherited from mom and dad, that, it's destiny. If you got the genes to develop any kind of disease, that will come, and there isn't there. And then this other genome that is the microbiome, extremely dynamic. While the first one is there, you can change it, but the second change based on a variety of conditions. If that premise that I believe is generally accepted is true, and if our destiny is really dictated by the interaction with the microorganism, then the way that, again, I personally interpret the story is the following. We need to find a friendly relationship with our microbiome, what we call a symbiotic relationship. How we do that? This is based on evolution. For 2 million years, the program was, okay, I'm born by vaginal delivery. The vast majority of my microbiome, engraftment happened there. Then I'm fed breast milk. until I introduce, solid food. And then eventually, and I live in a rural wild, and I eat in a certain way. I eat a lot of fruits, a lot of vegetable, tubers, nuts. Why? Because gathering this is easy. Meat, oh yeah, once in a while. You got to be a good hunter. And this lean meat, because, these animals are trying to escape predators, including human beings. So that's the way that we evolved. Now, why we see this increase of chronic inflammatory diseases? Because that plan, we derailed from that plan. We're born by C-section more than is needed. Of course, if it's clinically indicated, by all means, the alternative, is that you lose mom and child. You don't want to do that. But if this C-section is implemented so that the OBGYN can plan his or her, vacations, that's not a good way to do it. We feed the kids junk, so they don't eat the way that we used to. And we have now used and abused antibiotics that didn't exist 2 million years ago. And, again, all this translates the fact that the key first 1,000 days of life, from conception to, 2 years of life, are the ones in which we really decide our destiny way beyond that period. Why? Because it is the microbiome that program the immune system to unleash inflammation. And if we go through the plan of evolution, the microbiome that is being maturing and getting in a good relationship with us, because they've been nice finding each other. We all genetically are different. Even monozygotic twins, epigenetically are different. So there is no, quote unquote, a normal microbiome. Each of us has this very specific microbiome. So why genetically we're all different? Also, our microbiome is all different. The result of this interaction, on the other hand, has to be the same for everybody. Because the specific metabolic functions that keep my blood pressure in a certain range, the glucose level in a certain range, is the consequence of this interaction. So, in the first 2 years of life, actually, in the first 1,000 days of life, because it seems that the microbiome engraftment start even during pregnancy. It's debatable, but it looks like that's the case. Anything that disturb that searching each other, external elements like mom's lifestyle, she's smoking, there are pollution in the air, C-section again, the way that I'm fed, am I born premature, I'm getting antibiotics, whatever it is, that create that imbalance of the microbiome. And again, if you look at the dynamic, if you don't touch it, it seems to be very chaotic. At the beginning, there are some microorganisms, then they leave, then there's some others, they come. That's not chaos. It's searching each other, dating, until we find a sweet spot in general by the year 2, that we find the ideal relationship. If we do that, that microbiome will program the immune system to unleash inflammation only when it's extremely needed. 2 million years ago, when we started the journey of evolution as a species, we died either of an infection or a dinosaur with each other. Life expectancy was 13, 14 years, no time to develop cardiovascular diseases. So the immune system was mainly focused to protect us against inflammation, against microorganisms. And inflammation was nothing else that created a very hostile environment for microbes to grow. It's too hot. There are chemicals like cytokine that will kill me. There are cells like immune cells that would eat me. The tissue that's inflamed dies, but the organism will survive. So that's important why the bar for inflammation got to be very, very high. Now, particularly if we are in the Western lifestyle side of the story, doing that programming, because of this imbalance due to this derailment by external elements, the bar is put very low. And our programming to do inflammation is done in a way that we unleash it even when it's not extremely needed. And on a specific genetic background, It's a matter of time that we'll break tolerance and we develop a problem. This is a long way to answer why, the what happened in the gut. In another book I wrote, gut is not like Las Vegas. What happened in the gut doesn't stay in the gut. It really has, repercussion everywhere, because if there is this imbalance, there is no friendly relationship with our microbiome, we pay a dear price. And again, not just in the immediate, if we develop cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, metabolic disorder, Alzheimer's, and so on and so forth, all depends on how we program our immune system through the microbiome during that key period of time.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Dr. Fasano, so if I think about those things in the first 1,000 days that impact on our gut and or our immune system, essentially. So those people who were born through a C-section, are they then just already on the back foot? Like, I'm 45. If my mum had a C-section to have me, or do we not know that, or is it just like one sort of?
You are disadvantaged, but it's not the game is over. And the opposite also applies.
Yes.
If I'm born by vaginal delivery, it's not that I can eat junk and would not have a consequence. It's a continuum. So if you're born by C-section, you're at disadvantage, but that doesn't automatically means that it's your destiny, because, again, you can still play your genetic card correctly by having good lifestyle.
Yeah.
Exercising, low stress, eating well, a good sleeping hygiene. And, I can go on and on and on, not excessive alcohol, not excessive smoke, and so on and so forth. These are all conditions that, even if you have the bar very low because you were born by C-section and you're exposed to antibiotics and whatever, so you have an imbalanced microbiome, even if the bar is so low, but because of lifestyle, you mitigate the risk. Of course, if the bar is higher, you're better off, but neither one means that automatically, one, that you don't develop problem, on two, that you automatically will. It's a continuum. It's like, exercise. It's not that you exercise, once a year and now you will be healthy. It's something that you got to keep going and doing. But, I believe that all the elements that I was mentioning, just to say the Western lifestyle, we're born once with C-section or vaginal delivery. You can take antibiotics 3-4 times a year, but we eat 3-4 times a day. So definitely the most impactful to dictate the composition and the microbiome is diet. If you allow me a parallel, imagine that, the microbiome is a sort of farm with different animals. So as you have the chicken, you have the horses, you have the cows, you have the sheep, and so on and so forth. They eat different things. 2 million years ago, we decided that we have to have a farm with 1,000 chicken because we want to make eggs. 10 cows would be enough because we need a little bit of meat, a little bit of milk. We want sheep, 200 so we can have wood so that we can cover ourselves with something, and so on and so forth. And we were feeding accordingly. Now, fast forward to 2022, we eat so bad that we're feeding more the cows and not the chicken. And what is the consequence? Now we have an excessive amount of cows and we don't know what to do with that. And we don't have enough eggs because we don't have chicken around. Out of the metaphor, what I'm trying to say is this balance, you really want a diversity of microbes in there that they do, all check each other and they live in a friendly relationship with themselves and with their host. So everybody's happy. But if there is an imbalance in the diet, some of this, component of the microbiome would take over and the other would go disadvantage. So you have what we call dysbiosis. And that translates in unfriendly relationship without, and epigenetically can push the button to switch my genes to start their march from genetic predisposition to clinical outcome.
Yeah. And so with that gut microbiome and the diversity, I've heard that is an important feature of a healthy sort of gut microbiome. Are there other features that sort of, because there's not necessarily a normal, but that might be a feature of a healthy gut microbiome?
Yeah, again, as I told you, this is a work in progress. So for what we understand right now, diversity is good. You want a diverse microbiome. What is good for me may not be necessarily good for you. But again, we will understand this a little bit more in details now that the technology is available, that the cost of the technology now is more affordable. I'm pretty sure that we will reach a point in which we can answer your question by saying, oh, because you live in New Zealand, you have that genome and you have that lifestyle, your ideal microbiome is X. Let me take a look where you have. Oh, wow, it's Y. I need to bring this to X by whatever intervention that can be, again, diet, lifestyle, prebiotics, probiotics, symbiotics, postbiotics, any biotics that you can imagine, so that I can bring you back where you're supposed to be.
Yeah. So prebiotics and probiotics, and I do want to just ask you a couple of questions about them in a minute. People are well familiar with them. Symbiotics and postbiotics, though, I think these are terms which we don't hear as often, Dr. Fasano.
So,
what are they?
So prebiotics is the food that you give the microbes that are good for you so they can be thriving. Probiotics are the good bacteria. Symbiotics, when you have a product that have both. So let's say that I have classical good prebiotics. It's the sugar in the breast milk, the monooligosaccharides are unbelievable, great prebiotics. When you have that with a strain of probiotic, together it becomes a symbiotic. Postbiotic are products of the good bacteria. They are actually, improving my health. For example, butyrate, short-chain fatty acids are produced by some microorganisms. Those are postbiotics.
Yes. Okay. And of course, I've seen that you can actually take butyrate as a supplement, but also we produce butyrate as from our...
That's right. In other words, you can take a postbiotic, butyrate, as a supplement.
That's right.
To eventually, integrate what the microorganism in your gut, i.e. your microbiome, supposedly should do.
Yeah.
And if you're in dysbiosis, so you lost those components that produce that, in my parallel, the eggs, because now the chicken are not around anymore, then you have to buy the eggs from another farm, so you can have supplements.
Yeah. Dr. Fasano, how good are the consumer-based tests for microbiome? Because if it's so dynamic and the gut microbes are so dynamic, like if we do a test to sort of establish the balance of bacteria, is it that it is trending in the right direction? We have some idea, or can it be exact? What are those tests telling us? Is it worth doing even?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, this is one of the most, challenging questions to answer in this very dynamic field. There are already companies that they, analyze your microbiome on a relatively affordable price, and they tell you, oh, you're in good shape or bad shape. And some of them, they go to the next step. Oh, you have imbalance of your microbiome. Here, this product that I'll give you as a remedy of what's going on. I'm confident this can happen, but we don't have that kind of information right now because, just to give you a sense, we are dealing with a huge amount of microbes that live in symbiotic relationship with us. They are extremely dynamic. They mutate all the time because they reproduce every 20 minutes. We have a library of good understanding of the bacterial component microbiome, but we have viruses, we have, parasites, we are archaea. So that's much more complicated than we know right now. When we have a grasp of all this, and when, we can make sense of all this, meaning that, now doing my genome is relatively simple, but imagine 40 years ago was unthinkable that you can have entire genome of an individual. Same story. We're lagging back 5, 6, 7 years, depending on your opinion, with the microbiome studies when it comes to its genomic component, what we call metagenomics. When we will have that, and we will have mathematical modeling to say, okay, I have 23,000 genes. I have 100 times more genes for the microbiome. Where are all the computations that will keep me healthy? And where are the computations? Let's say that you have 3 zillions of possible, computation here. There are much more than that. Of this, where are the 500,000 computation interaction that will make me sick that I need to avoid. And the rest is fine. When I got that, now we have an answer. But, you can't study this outside the other omics. I just mentioned the genomics. But, you need to look at your metabolites, because ultimately this interaction will produce metabolites that actually will control some functions that will keep me healthy or will make me sick. The proteomics, what kind of proteins will be produced by this genomic switch of the microbiome on my genes and how they impinge on my health. The lipidomics, and I can go with many other omics, and this put in the context of who am I, where I live, what is my lifestyle. When you compute all these variables in there, you will realize, as I typically say to my students, that you have almost an infinite variability of possibility there, because the genome of the human being is like a piano with 23,000 notes. Can you sing, are you, limited to only 23,000, tunes? Absolutely not. The piano player that is in the microbiome can play 1, 2, all 23,000 with a certain rhythm, with a different frequency. So it's infinite, the outcome, the kind of music that will come out of there. It depends who sits, your piano and what kind of music they play. And the music is the metabolic pathways that will control my, vital functions. So all this to say, once we got all this, then we can answer the question, is that worth it to analyze my microbiome to understand, am I good? I'm not good? What should I do about it? Why we don't get there, and we will. Common sense is to live a good lifestyle that will not stress my microbiome.
Yeah. That does make perfect sense. And with respect to, if you do, how does someone know if they have gut dysbiosis beyond gut-related symptoms? Things that you actually feel digestively, or is that the best way to assess this? What other things are sort of associated in your experience, Dr. Fasano?
So it's not just GI symptoms. Again, you may have GI symptoms with little or no dysbiosis, and you can be completely silent clinically in your GI tract, and you have dysbiosis. So the clinic will not help me. Again, I can tell you that there are people with rheumatoid arthritis, for example, that they have no GI symptoms, but they are completely in disarray with their microbiome. And there are people that they have, some functional disordered GI tract, like irritable bowel syndrome, that may not have dysbiosis. So there is no clear clinical red flag that would tell me, I better check my microbiome. It's just the opposite. Meaning, because I have seen in the literature that people with rheumatoid arthritis may have dysbiosis, I better check my microbiome if I have RA.
Yeah.
Because, I know that some people with cancer will respond to anti-cancer therapy more efficiently than others because the microbiome, if I don't respond to that specific treatment, I better check my microbiome. That's more likely the way that we're going to do this for what we define as personalized medicine.
Okay. No, that makes sense.
But of course, as I told you, primary prevention for me is very dear. If we made a mistake in the past, if we understand what mistake we made, maybe that we can intercept the disease before the onset. And there's we are in the midst of one of these projects with celiac disease. The project is called CDGEM, and the second one on autism is called GEMMA, to do exactly that. So we follow from birth these kids, taking advantage that both diseases materialize rather early in life. And we want to see what are the deviation of microbiome that systematically we see before the onset of the disease in those that end up to develop the problem compared to the one that did not. And trying to figure out, what is my point of attack that eventually I can go after that can allow me to correct, the journey of the microbiome of this kid so that he or she would not break tolerance to gluten or God knows what else in autism. so that they don't develop this, inflammatory process anymore. So that it's something that is doable, but will require, once again, modeling, artificial intelligence that will tell me, oh, if you have these 5 strains that are not there anymore, you have 92% chance to develop in a year celiac disease. Put these 5 strains back there.
Yeah, yeah. And is it with the probiotics that we see on the shelf? Do they make a big difference to our overall gut health, given the dynamic nature of our gut? And
I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, it's not because they are not. Well, first of all, the entire field is poorly regulated for a simple reason that rules from Europe and United States, if you want to treat, ameliorate, or prevent the disease, you have to go through the scrutiny of drug development. So you have to do clinical trial. Producers of probiotics, they want to avoid that because it's a lot of money that you have to put on the table. So they promulgate the use of probiotics as improving health. So not making any claims, but say these are good for you, meaning that I can sell this in the supermarket, the pharmacy, whatever, these probiotics without the scrutiny to make sure that, they are really helpful in mitigating, disease A, B, or C. The other corollary of this problem is they are not controlled. So sometimes probiotics, they don't contain enough strains because you have to have billions of strains in there. They can be unstable over time because these are live organisms and they can die. They can have pathogens in there because there is no controls. And, again, I'm not trying to dispute their validity. I'm pretty sure that, some of them, they may have validity. But again, it's a shot in the dark because if let's say that, I have a dysbiosis and I have, let's say dermatitis, and you have a dermatitis as well, and you have your dysbiosis. And I see on the shelves a probiotics X that help me to mitigate my skin rash. That may be good for me if I lost that particular strain,
yes,
but not good for you that you didn't lose that strain. You lose another strain with the same clinical outcome. Yeah. So that's not the way to go. If we want to use anything that's already in the market, it would be better to use a product with multiple strains. At least you increase your chance of the right target. And even better is to use natural products. A good yogurt in which there are fresh probiotics there are many strains and so on and so forth, is probably better than a formulation that you have to buy on the shelves. That would be my sense.
And you mentioned before about how zonulin or an excessive amount of zonulin can be produced with gut dysbiosis. And then, of course, zonulin can be overproduced for people who have an insensitive or who are sensitive to gluten, not necessarily just celiac, but people who are sensitive to gluten. If you fix the dysbiosis and the zonulin is then therefore just produced in normal amounts, then gluten doesn't necessarily feature. Is that right? So people who might think they're gluten intolerant might in fact actually just have a gut dysbiosis that once they fix, actually they're not gluten intolerant.
That's right. So bottom line, again, you need all 5 pillars to develop any problem, including gluten sensitivity. You have to have the genetic predisposition for gluten sensitivity. You need to eat gluten. You have to have a barrier that doesn't work anymore through zonulin or any other mechanism. You have to have the immune system that also is not working right, and you have to have dysbiosis. You got to have them all. It's not just the gluten that increased zonulin that's a done deal. Because even if, hypothetically, I have gluten, the gluten increased gut permeability via zonulin. Now I am in your body. What happened to me depends what my genes are doing. And if you don't have dysbiosis, the genes that will make me reactive about gluten may not have been activated. So nothing happened. But if you do have dysbiosis and these genes have been activated, now you have that problem that will eventually create the condition of inflammation. And then you have also other genes that when you're turned on, the inflammation doesn't turn off anymore. So the hyperbelligerent immune system becomes part of the story.
Yeah, okay. And do you know, Dr. Fasano, I know quite a few people who in adulthood have been diagnosed with celiac, and the description is silent celiac. So obviously, as you've just said, they need all 5 of these pillars to be present and activated in order for that to happen. But how does someone go for like 40 years without realizing that they have celiac disease?
We thought that was the case. Not anymore. Again, the silent celiac disease exists. We know this through studies with relatives. They are higher risk that we fall over time. And then at some point, they have positive serology, they have damaged the intestine, but the symptoms are not there yet. And this is explained because the target organ, it's very long, it's 10 meters long. And if you have only a few inches inflamed, a few centimeters inflamed, you may not have symptoms. But as disease progresses, you will.
Yes.
But the cases that develop celiac disease after 40 years are not silent celiac disease. And we know this is a fact because we follow thousands of people at risk over time. And some of these people, they have negative serology, negative endoscopy for 30, 40 years. So they were eating gluten, the genes were there, but they did not have the problem at all. Meaning, again, that there were not the 5 elements all there quite yet.
Yes.
So they were eating gluten, they had the genes, but they were not activated to do anything. They may have or not increased permeability, but the microbiome was not as balanced. And therefore, epigenetically, these genes are not put in motion yet. So these are people that these are the people that, indeed, if they understand what's done wrong in terms of composition microbiome, they may never develop celiac disease, rather than develop one they are 40 or 50.
Yeah, interesting. And that actually just reminds me of something I used to hear a few years ago, was because, of course, there are many people who would avoid gluten, not because they were celiac, but because they had heard, a lot of bad, that it wasn't good to eat. So they would avoid gluten. Then they wouldn't feed their children any gluten from the get-go. And then and I remember seeing it reported, well, first and foremost, that you should expose your children to gluten so they develop antibodies against it. I don't know, this is just what you hear. But then that was disputed. So what is can you sort of shed light on that?
The people that promulgate this idea that everybody needs to be gluten-free, otherwise we'll be extinct as a species, they always quote our work as a backup for that kind of statement. It's not true. As I said, and I'm so sorry to repeat myself.
No, I like it.
Eating gluten that causes increased permeability in everybody is not enough to develop problems at all. You got to have the other elements to do that. As a matter of fact, an antigen trafficking can be a good thing, so the immune system will know what is the surrounding and get ready to be fighting. Of course, if you have the other elements, i.e. the genetic predisposition, the increased gut permeability, the immune system is not working right, the epigenetic pressure or dysbiotic microbiome, and so on and so forth, then that's a problem. But, not everybody has all these 5 elements. So there is not justifiable that, people, they need to be maintained gluten-free because a priori because it's poison for you. If it was not for gluten, meaning agriculture, you and I were still jumping from a tree and another. And being, chimpanzees are not human beings. We unleash our creativity because the 90% of time that we invested in food procurement has been freed up to do other creative stuff.
Yeah, completely. Now, Dr. Fasano, you've done a lot of work in non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And I've heard you speak about it before, that it is a thing, like it's actually a thing that people do, that some people do have. I feel like it's not a very well understood concept, because a lot of doctors and health professionals are like, well, if you're not celiac, then you don't need to worry at all about avoiding gluten, but I know plenty of people who have symptoms related to eating gluten-containing products and are not celiac. So why is there this almost, backlash against?
Well, I was among the doctors that say, if you don't have celiac disease, you don't have a business to be on a gluten-free diet, because, that's what we were taught. But the beauty of science is that, that change every 2 years. So the truth of today is garbage in 2 years from now. And there is nothing worse than the physician or the investigator that does not have the open-mindedness to appreciate that things are dynamic. And I was, convinced by my patients, because I said, look for something else. They came back and said, true, I'm not celiac. Guess what? The only thing that keeps me healthy is a gluten-free diet. Call me whatever, but I stick with the program. That's how this story all started. And I don't think there is people now, they are experts in the field, and the vast majority of people that read the literature will not dispute that we have a spectrum of gluten-related disorder. There is the autoimmune problem with celiac disease, there is the allergic problem with allergy, and there is this other non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So I don't think that this is disputable anymore. And ultimately, I'm not here to win a contest to be right or wrong. I'm here to take care of patients, whatever it takes. And, maybe that, non-celiac gluten sensitivity is not a well-defined entity, mainly because we don't have a biomarker as we have with celiac disease and with allergy. But for the time being, until we find something to define better these people, the only way that we have is to say, okay, you have a problem with gluten, meaning that you're sick when you eat it and you are better when you do not. If I exclude celiac disease and with allergy, I call you non-celiac gluten sensitivity until I find a better way to define you. That's pretty much what it is.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And in practice, it is that sort of elimination approach is almost a gold standard for a lot of these sort of food sensitivities where there's no definitive sort of biomarker. Dr. Fasano, obviously you're Italian, and yet you're in Boston. Like, are there differences now? I don't know how long it's been since you've been to Italy, but like, do you look at the food supply in your and where you live now versus like how you were growing up, or just even in Italy today? Like, how different is it? Out of interest,
I would say very different. When I was growing up, first of all, I was raised with what was called the poor diet. We were of a humble origin. We couldn't afford to eat meat every day. Not that I miss it, but, for us, it was a feast where we had meat, once every week, maybe 10 days. But what was our diet? A lot of fruits, vegetables, legumes, pasta, and so on and so forth. What we call the Mediterranean diet. Fish that you all local, all in season. Now, even in Italy, but for example, a product typical of New Zealand, kiwi, I never saw it until, a few years ago. When I was growing up, there was no such a thing. The most exotic fruit that we have were bananas. They came, from North Africa, not far from where we are. So, but still, that was very exotic. But, strawberries, July and August. Strawberries in February, nonsense.
Yeah.
Now, I believe that the major problem that we're seeing with the food supply have been these three dramatic changes, epochal changes in human life. Advent of agriculture 10,000 years ago. Domesticating crops, now, again, this was a key passage for evolution, by the way. But, we do not use natural product anymore, but we domesticate the products.
Yeah.
Urbanization. When people, they start to move in the cities, now they were consumers, but, when I grew up not when I grew up, but I remember that my grandfather and his grandfather, they were farmers. Say they produce their own needs and they exchange with other farmers for other products so that they have everything they need. everybody was producing stuff for their own needs in terms of food. When you have people, they go to the cities and do other jobs, now they are consumers. So farmers, they need to produce for themselves because they still need that. And they sell the product to the folks that are not producing anymore. So you have to step up a different way to produce your goods, and again, techniques, they change. You have to use chemicals to avoid that you waste, your produce and so on and so forth. But the third and most impactful, almost the kiss of death, in my humble opinion, major revolution has been, the globalization. Few multinational, companies that take the monopoly of the production of some of the food that we eat. And when you have the large productions, quality always suffers for many, many, many reasons. Again, it's a long way to answer your question. Yeah, we eat very differently, not only here in Boston, but also in Italy. And again, this is part of the consequence of Western lifestyle. There is a revival, I have to say, in pricing, local stuff coming from local farmers, organic food, and so on and so forth, grass-fed beef and that kind of stuff. But once again, paradoxically, that was the way that we eat when we have no means. Right? It was the diet of the poor. Now this is the diet of the wealthy.
It is.
If I have $5 a day, and I'm a single mother with 2 kids, guess what? I'm not going to buy fruit and vegetables. I'm going to buy junk food that will fill the belly of my kids.
Yeah, for sure. And Dr. Fasano, the first of all, you mentioned local a few times, and outside of obviously carbon footprint reasons, and I don't think that's necessarily, actually, I don't know, maybe that is why you're saying it, but is it something to do with where we grow our food and the microbes in the soil?
Of course.
Okay, yeah. And so it's sort of geographical.
Imagine this, okay, to stick with the gluten. I eat wheat that is produced in Ukraine, okay? Needs to be produced in a certain way. I don't know if they put chemicals so that, because if you lose 5% of the product, that's an economic disaster. They go in these big containers. They have to cross the ocean and they come to me. Imagine how many steps these grains needs to go through and bringing me a microbiome that is not mine, acquire another microbiome in the container, coming over here that will be used, processed in a certain way, some anti-cryptogenic or fertilizers that are in the soil now are in the actual grain. This is all stuff that was not part of what was supposed to be.
Yeah. That makes sense. And you mentioned organic. So if we had the means, would your recommendation be to buy organic where we can?
Well, if you mean for organic, again, grass-fed beef, free, chicken that, they're out, and so free-caged chicken and so on and so forth, I think that definitely would be worthwhile. If you buy organic water, that's a scam.
Yeah, okay, yeah. No, it makes sense.
I'm saying organic water because they sell organic water.
Oh, goodness. Okay, yeah. Yeah, okay. And then finally, Dr. Fasano, I know that over the last couple of years, or at least I've seen on PubMed, you've published a lot around COVID and the potential relationship with our immune system, our gut. Can you just spend a couple of minutes talking about what you're looking at and some of the information that you're finding?
So, again, one of the most puzzling parts, as soon as we locked down for COVID and repurposed all our research on COVID, was why kids are not involved. At the beginning, they seem to be spared. And this is unusual for a viral infection. The first one to contract a viral infection are kids. But they were not, in our hospitals, they seem to be immune. And then we realized that was not the case. And through that, we also realized that the vital cycle of SARS-CoV-2 is, yes, the port of entry is the nose, but they stay there for few days, very few days. And then for the old elderly, they can go all the way down to the lower airways in the lungs, and they can kill you. But they find the biological niche in the GI tract. That's where they sit for weeks, if not for months, both in adults and kids, and cause dysbiosis and cause release of zonulin. And this will cause, in a subgroup of kids, the leaking of some of the elements of SARS-CoV-2, including spike in the bloodstream. And that creates the condition to make the immune system to go bananas, to generate the cytokine storm, and develop complication like COVID, long COVID, or the multi-organ inflammatory system in children or MIS-C. So all this, in other words, is once back again, dysbiosis, increased antigen trafficking, and creating the problem. And now we have 2 clinical trials, one on MIS-C, the other one on long COVID, to try to mitigate all this by blocking zonulin.
Yeah, okay, that's super interesting. And when you were looking at all of the recommendations around how, from a public health perspective, what we were told about how to keep us well from COVID, was any part of you thinking, if only they gave some advice on gut health?
Yeah, no, again, we were part of the syndicated situation, so we were aware that, a lot of people with long COVID have GI symptoms. A lot of these kids with MIS-C, they do. But the fact that we look at where this virus sits, we cannot find the airways, we cannot find the blood. And yet, months, weeks after, you can develop this complication. Where is the virus? And it was only a matter of logical thinking that we look in the largest reservoir we have, and sure enough, it was there, and sure enough, was creating dysbiosis.
Yeah, and ultimately, it does come back to a lot of what you've discussed today, in that, yes, there are things that we can't control, but there are things within our control, hopefully, and the diet and the lifestyle piece, that's really important in terms of our overall risk.
Yeah, indeed. Who pays the most price, the morbidity and mortality of COVID-19? People that had precondition that can control with their behavior. Obesity, cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders like type 2 diabetes, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. No, amazing. Dr. Fasano, thank you so much for your time this morning. I feel like we've done a bit of a whirlwind tour on your work, and I could talk to you for hours. Can you let the audience know where they can find your books and your most recent one, Gut Feeling, from, I believe it was 2021 that you published?
That's right. That was really a major undertaking because of the dynamic of the field. But some of the principles about microbiome health are there. So if you want to expand a little bit of what you heard in this hour, gut feeling is definitely the way to go. But parenthetically, we don't make any money with that. Whatever, revenues are all for going for research.
Yeah, amazing. And so is that just on your website,
Well, you can find it on Amazon anywhere.
Perfect.
So if you Google, Good Feeling Alessio Fasano, you will find it anywhere.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then, of course, in the show notes, we will put a link to your research publication so people can find out more of that, and, of course, to your books as well. Dr. Fasano, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Mikki, for having me.
Alrighty. Awesome guy, honestly. And I also just really loved hearing him speak, actually, being Italian, and hearing sort of how the diet changes that we talked about in the interview, the Western diet, sort of the US diet versus, his traditional growing up diet, and also what the diet's like in Italy now. Anyway, as I said, links to his books and also where you can find Dr. Fasano can be found in the show notes. Next week on the podcast, I speak to Australian Marty Kendall from Optimizing Nutrition, all about the tools he's created to help thousands of people optimize the nutrients in their diet, data-driven fasting and what that even is, the effect of dietary fat on insulin, and so much more. You do not want to miss that. Until then, though, you can catch me over on Facebook at Williden Nutrition, over on Instagram and Twitter at Williden, or jump onto my website and sign up to the Mondays Matter waitlist so you get early notification of when Mondays Matter Shreduary registration begins. It is in a few weeks. You do not want to miss out. It is bigger and better than ever before. Otherwise, you can also book a one-on-one consult with me, sign up to one of my real food nutrition plans or other self-directed fat loss plans, the ones that you do at your own pace, all with the support of me behind you. All right, guys, that is at mikkywilliden.com, and I will catch you next week.